Hey there, and welcome to today's episode. I'm excited to have you here and be here with you. I'm flying solo today because I am going to talk to you about the Oats test. So, I recently did a training in basic reading of the Oats test just about a month ago, intro, and I just got my Oats test results back this week. And so, I wanted to break those down for you and the why you care about doing something like the Oats test. So it is a functional test that shows us a lot of different things I'll explain here in a minute. But the reason that we want to do this kind of testing is because we get to see what's actually going on in your body. Otherwise, we're just guessing. Symptoms can mean many different things. It can be several different nutrient deficiencies. One symptom can mean that. So to actually see what's happening in your body, and then we can work with that, right? If it's nutrient deficiencies, we can bring more of those nutrients in, etc. And it was also an interesting experience. I have done all the tests that I utilize with clients, but it's been a minute since I've done some testing. So it was good for me to get a test again and be sort of in the client seat of receiving the information that can be kind of overwhelming sometimes. I'm not going to lie. There's a lot that these things can tell us, and it's kind of scary sometimes to hear what's going on in your body. And it's also, yeah, overwhelming some of the changes that need to be made. I will say, though, one of the big mindset approaches to this, and kind of what I had to click into for myself, is really saying, wow, okay, now I have this information. I knew that there was something going on. And so now I have the information to make the changes. And that's really a good thing because otherwise I'm just going along and not feeling my best. And, that's things are just going to get worse if we don't make changes. And, I'm going to be very honest with you all today about, some of the symptoms that I've been dealing with lately, because, health is a journey. Just because I'm a functional health coach doesn't mean that everything's perfect inside of me. Particularly those of us that have had physical trauma. All trauma impacts our health on multiple levels, including, our ability to utilize our foods and the nutrients in foods and leaky gut and all of these things. But, particularly in my situation, I did lose half of my colon and 8 inches of small intestine. And I could see on this test how that's showing up, 2.5, almost 2.5 years after I got my ostomy reversed, and almost 3 years since the damage first occurred. So it's going to be a lifelong thing. It's something that I have to continuously work with. And I could tell that there were some changes going on in me. Just simply like my stool has not been as good as it had been. I'm definitely dealing more with loose stools again, which is very common post ostomy reversal surgeries. Just because really the microbiome changes so much. So, anyways, that's going to show up on this test. So I wanted to share that with you guys. And also there's always, some really good things, and that showed up on this test for me, and I was very pleasantly surprised. And then some other things that it took me a minute to really breathe into and handle, and then get excited about taking the next step in my journey. So hopefully that for any of you guys that are doing testing with practitioners, or that are working with me or will work with me, you can take some of that in when you get these kinds of results, and really sit in the place of, this is giving me the knowledge that I need to truly get better. So what is the Oats test? So the Oats stands for organic acid testing. And there are several different labs that do this kind of testing. Even, you guys have heard me talk about the Dutch a lot on here, and it has a small Oats panel as part of it. The Oats test that I am utilizing and that I did the training with is through Great Plains Laboratory. And they are really kind of the leader in terms of mold identification in the body, environmental toxin panels. So I actually did an add on to my Oats panel to see some of the environmental toxins that are in my body, and that's a whole other thing to go into. Maybe I'll do another episode on that. Um, and organic, why do we care about organic acid tests, and what is it? So basically, we have these compounds that show up in our urine that are metabolites of everything we take in, really. Everything that we take in, food, supplements, toxins from anything from alcohol to like environmental toxins. Our body processes that and metabolizes that and then excretes it via sweat, via our urine, and via our stool, right? These are our main exitory pathways. So this is why, our gut is so important in our health. Our liver is so important because it does it's the heavy lifter with, detoxifying things right off the bat, and then our kidneys too. And so we want all of those, working as well as they can in order to just keep things moving out of our body that we don't want to be stored in our body. Because, you know, I already knew this, but this training solidified for me that so much of our illnesses are due to chemical toxins being stored in our body, a wide variety of chemical toxins. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. The oat does not go deep into that, but sort of gives you an indication, whether there's stuff going on. So you probably want to do further testing, like the environmental tox test. So I did the oat, and basically what the oat covers is, so there's kind of two big things I think that a lot of people want to take the oats test for, or that practitioners utilize for their clients and patients, because there's doctors use this test also, is for mold and for yeast. So it's not going to tell you all the mold. There is another test that you would take based off of the indications of mold on the oat, right? But aspergillus is what it's really looking at, in a big way on the oat. And so that's a good way to know, okay, I need to dive further, figure out what molds are in my body, what mycotoxins are, being released from those molds. And then yeast is often connected to mold. And it was fascinating to learn, really yeast is just kind of a descendant of mold. So they're very intricately connected. And often when you have mold, you have yeast. And for those of you that have had yeast issues for a long time, this like, make a pin in this one. Yeast, if you can't get rid of it, it's often an indication that there is a mold issue in your body too. I know that I dealt with yeast for years, really, big time in my 20s. I was worried about it in my reversal surgery because I had to take so many antibiotics. I started having yeasty symptoms right before my reversal surgery. So I didn't know how that would all go down. The antibiotics kill all our beneficial bacteria, but it doesn't kill yeast because that's a fungus. So yeast has a chance to proliferate when all that beneficial bacteria is killed by the antibiotics along with the bad bacteria. So, that's why a lot of times women will get yeast infections after a round of antibiotics, and why it's so important to bring in probiotics. Big debate on when, in terms of taking antibiotics. I would personally go with taking probiotics while you're on antibiotics, but opposite ends of the day. That's an aside. So those are the two of the big things that people, gather and use the oat test for. But it also goes into a lot of other, aspects that you may not really find on other testing. So it dives deep into Clostridia, strains of Clostridia. And Clostridia is basically, different bacteria. There's different strains of the Clostridia, and it's really prevalent in dysbiosis. So gut dysbiosis, things, bad bacteria being too high and beneficial bacteria being too low. Most people maybe have heard of C. diff. That's kind of the shortcut for Clostridia difficile. And this is a really common invasive bacteria that happens post surgery. It's really unfortunate because a lot of times people will have to do it's just multiple rounds of antibiotics and just have crazy amounts of diarrhea. And it's, as far as I know, still the only thing that is um, allowed by the FDA to do a fecal matter transplant here in the United States. If you have C. diff that does not respond to antibiotics, I think you have to take several rounds before you're allowed to do that. But they found fecal matter transplants something like 90% of the time will help with C. diff. So there's multiple strains of this Clostridia, and Oat is looking at that. But it's good to know if C. diff is an issue for you. Um, it also looks at oxalates. And so this is a really fascinating thing. I feel like people have been talking about like histamine and oxalates lately. It's like kind of the big thing. If you have delved into any carnivore, groups or discussions or podcasts, people talk a lot about oxalates and what's called oxalate dumping when you go on the carnivore diet. And what oxalates are basically these compounds, chemical compounds in plants, in some of what we consider the healthiest foods out there, and unfortunately, I mean, they're called sometimes an anti-nutrient. And this is what I, have to explain to people a lot in terms of plant foods not always being the best for everyone, or, an overabundance of them. So basically, plants, they want to survive, they want to protect themselves. And so they have what is called anti-nutrients, which helps essentially protect them. Like, the reason that you see, seeds come out in the toilet is because they have this protection, phytates that help protect, so they're not broken down in your body, because they want to come out the other side and be planted in the ground and spawn forward, right? And so oxalates are considered one of these anti-nutrients that essentially are protective of the plant but are not great for us. They bind to calcium in the body, and they can create um, basically these, oxalate crystals that are dropped in our tissues, really all over. The sort of worst case scenario is when this happens in your kidneys and calcium deposits in there, and then lo and behold, you have kidney stones. So this is why we care about oxalates. It can cause a ruckus in many different ways. It can cause a lot of inflammation in the body. It can impact our hormones. It can impact our thyroid. Oxalate crystals can actually be deposited in our thyroid. So, it is something that's important to know if you've kind of tried a lot of stuff and you're still not feeling fantastic. I don't really recommend trying a low oxalate diet just on its own, because it's not a super easy diet if you like plant foods. I would recommend testing and seeing how your oxalates are doing. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we get into my oat test. It also covers how some of your B vitamins are doing and your glutathione, which are all very important for your detox mechanisms in your body. Talk a lot about, both of these components for estrogen detox. You need enough of the B vitamins and glutathione to be able to, properly methylate, and really what your phase 2 liver detox is looking like. And a lot of us are low on those. For those of you that have had an ostomy or have had some kind of diminishment of your small intestine, particularly the last part of your small intestine, which is called the terminal ileum, we can have a harder time absorbing. That's where we absorb our B vitamins. So it's not, uncommon, especially with B12, to have a lower amount if you have lost some of your terminal ileum. So just keep that in mind. And these B vitamins are super important. The oat also shows us some of the neurotransmitters, which is, all of this stuff is really interconnected, and this is what I love about this test. And particularly the pharmaceutical approach to things like anxiety and depression can be helpful, but there is a physical underlying cause going on, majority of the time. And if we don't see that and we don't know that and we don't work with that, then we're really missing a big component of why we have depression happening, and it's not simple. It's not, a one and done kind of thing. Don't get me wrong. Like, you have to take a very holistic approach to depression, anxiety. I'm not against meds, particularly in some cases. Like, it's the only thing that's going to get you out of bed. Do it, and to know what your neurotransmitters are looking like, and what may be impacting them is really helpful, because it's only going to help in the process of your body getting those neurotransmitters that it needs, in order to have sort of, more stable mental state. So that's pretty cool. um so, you're listening to this because you're into hormones, so you may be wondering, well, what exactly does this test have to do with hormones? And, as I mentioned, knowing how your detox is doing is really important. How your liver is doing, and there's markers on here that really can show you a lot about that, because we want to be detoxing your hormones well too, particularly estrogen, because of the estrogen dominant situation that is so common for women, particularly as we get into perimenopause. And I've talked so much on this podcast. So if you've listened for a while, you know how important gut health is for hormone health. So if you have, gut dysbiosis going on, you're going to have inflammation in your body, which is going to directly impact your hormones, and it's going to raise your cortisol. And, the thing about cortisol, which is released by the adrenals, if your body is focusing on that cortisol production and, being in that sympathetic nervous system all the time, it's going to down regulate your sex hormone production. And we see this a lot with particularly lowered progesterone. So you got to take care of your adrenals if you want your sex hormones to do well. And so you got to make sure inflammation's down in your body if you want your adrenals to be taken care of. What else? Let's see. Oxalates, can definitely play an issue with leaky gut too. And they also can impair the methylation or phase 2 detox. So, we hear all this stuff about like drink green smoothies, and that in some cases may be kind of the worst thing to do for your hormones if you have an issue with oxalates. And I'll talk more about that here as we dive in. All right, so I'm going to share the test for those that are watching this. And if you're listening and you want to see what the test looks like, you can go to my YouTube channel. I'll put the link in the notes, but it's just, Christine Garvin, and you can see the test there. But I'll try and explain things really well, so if you are just listening to the podcast, that you can get, as much information as you can. Okay, I'm gonna do a little share screen here. Share. Okay, so hopefully you are seeing the Great Plains laboratory test here. I'm going to go down this information a little bit. So this first page is really about the yeast and the mold that I mentioned, that is so important for this test and why so many people want this test. So this whole first section is yeast and fungal markers. So you'll see the aspergillus here on, 4 of them. So those are really related to mold. And then I believe, so I'm not positive that this one also is related to mold, while the other ones are more yeast. So arabinose is kind of the big one to look for in terms of yeast. At first, when I looked at this, I was like, oh, I'm high. I'm actually not high. I am within the range here, but it's just something to kind of keep an eye on. I was very happy to not have any mold markers high. I was, a little bit concerned with the possibility of yeast being high. But again, this is just something like, okay, it could come out to play if I let I let my guard down, let's put it that way. But it's not actually elevated in this situation, which I was very happy about. The next section is bacterial markers, of which I am, doing well. A little bit low on the beneficial bacteria, which is not surprising. I am still really rebuilding my gut, and to a certain extent, I probably will be for a while. And I have gone back and forth between some eradication protocols and kind of focusing on beneficial bacteria. And I just really and finding, and this is another little note for people that do have, uh, you know, um, had an ostomy, have an ostomy, have probably any kind of complication with their intestine from, UC to Crohn's or any of this. I, I think too long of eradication is not a good idea, even if you are taking beneficial bacteria while doing the eradication. Um, there needs to be some breaks and some real focus on rebuilding, which is what I am getting into right now because I can tell with how, my stool has changed recently. And some of the other symptoms that are up, that it's really time to focus on that. And you can see in the next section, for those that are watching, that I'm not going to really attempt to say this because it's a really tough word. Well, I'll try. Hydro Hydroxenophilactic. The 4-hydrophenolactic. This is definitely not my forte, if you can't already tell, which oversees C. diff, as I mentioned earlier, and then several other strains of Clostridia is high at 111. The reference range high end is 19. So it's high. It's not like 900, but it's high. So, looking at that, first off, I could be like, well, shit, do I have C. diff? But this 4-cresol, down here, number 17, that is the specific C. diff one. So luckily that is not high. So I'm grateful for that. What, these things mean essentially when this marker is high is a couple of possibilities. So it can be SIBO, which is small intestine bacterial overgrowth. And that is something that I have been nervous about, to be honest with you, because I lost my ileocecal valve, which is the valve between the small intestine and the colon. And it kind of, acts as a holder of your food until your colon is ready, right? So keep things sort of in that small intestine until it's ready to go into the colon. And the bacteria of the colon is very different than the bacteria of the small intestine. As far as we know at this point, there shouldn't be a ton of bacteria hanging out in your small intestine. Things move pretty fast there. The bacteria should be more in your colon. And what can happen in SIBO is that bacteria from the colon backs up into the small intestine. And basically, you end up having this overgrowth of bacteria in your small intestine where it shouldn't be. If you've lost your ileocecal valve, like I have, then there's no door there to protect bacteria from moving from my colon back into my small intestine. So I feel like this is something that I'm going to have to pay attention to for my lifetime. Unfortunately, the realities of medical trauma. I just want to remind people that medical trauma is a real thing that happens. I think it's the third biggest killer in our country, in the United States. Not trying to scare people off of surgery. Sometimes you have to have surgery, but I think it's really not talked about enough how much damage is done to people. And that's just deaths. When I talk about third most common death, there's lots of people that have had medical injuries that are still here and kicking, and we're dealing with it for the rest of our lives. So it's legit. I don't think I have SIBO. I don't really have any of the other sort of common SIBO issues. So one of the other reasons that this Clostridia will be high for people, these Clostridia strains, is because of ileocecal resection, which is essentially what I had, right? That just means ileocecal is just like a connection between um, that your small intestine and your colon. So between all the antibiotics that I had to take, I was on 2 weeks of IV antibiotics, 10 days of, oral antibiotics after that, and then another 10 days of oral antibiotics after I had my reversal surgery. Plus, I think they used antibiotics in the surgeries themselves because they usually do prophylactically. I mean, that's a lot of antibiotics. And I just want to stress to people it is not easy to bounce back from antibiotics. It really isn't. Sometimes you got to take them, but like when you've had multiple rounds of antibiotics in your lifetime, it's really hard to get your beneficial bacteria up to the levels that it needs to be. And so this is where taking a good, quality probiotic and really switching out good quality probiotics so that you get different strains over time is really important. And so I think that this marker is high for me um, because of my resection and all the antibiotics that I had to take, and I'm still needing to up that beneficial bacteria. So that's why I'm focusing now on really building it back up, with multiple strains, and some in particular that will be good for short chain fatty acid production. Very helpful for the gut too. Okay, so the other ones are good, which made me happy. So all in all, page one, I was pretty happy. I mean, of course, I wasn't excited about the Clostridia being high, but I was very happy for mold and yeast to not be an issue. And let's hop on down to the page 3, technically. Here we are, first section looking at oxalates. So, I talked a lot about this in the beginning, and lo and behold, I do have high oxalic acid. I'm at 152, where the high end is 101. So, it's not like crazy high again, but it's high enough. And then I also have high glyceric, which means that I have a genetic predisposition to not dealing with oxalates. So this was definitely news to me. Histamine hasn't been an issue for me. I didn't necessarily think that oxalates was an issue for me. I don't have, the kind of joint pain that often can come with it. My kidneys have, there's been some, definitely when I go to acupuncturists and stuff, there's kidney deficiency sometimes. So maybe that's sort of how it's showing up. But knock on wood, I have not had kidney stones. That doesn't mean that there's not calcium deposits happening. My one sort of indication of this, and I want to just speak to this because this is where it's so important for each of us to, get to know our bodies and then trust our intuition, because our bodies will speak to us, right? And you may not always know what it means right away, but like keep keep track of that and try and talk to somebody that might be able to help you with it. About, I don't know, a few months after my reversal surgery, I had one of my teeth in the back, just like a little piece cracked off, and I've never had anything like that happen before. And automatically I was like, oh my god, I must be low in calcium, and what's fascinating right now, right? Everybody's talking about magnesium. Like, you need to take all the magnesium and don't take calcium because, I mean, for good reason. Most of us are low in magnesium. We need it for like 300 processes in our body. Um, and you need enough magnesium for your body to utilize calcium correctly. But you can still get too much magnesium without getting enough calcium too. And it obviously depends on what's happening in your body, but in a situation where you have high oxalates, you're not absorbing calcium because oxalates bind to calcium, right? So I basically had this situation happen where my tooth broke off, small part of it, and it was really a sign like, I don't have enough calcium going on, and I didn't really know the why. And so this is kind of an explanation of why, because those oxalates have been binding to that calcium. So I'm not able to utilize that calcium. So, calcium and magnesium work together very closely. They're kind of like the yin and the yang of the electrolytes. And then like potassium and sodium work together really, closely too. I won't go into all the specifics around that right now. But again, you need to make sure that there's a balance going on there. So I had already started taking some calcium and magnesium together, but now that I know that I have high oxalates, one of the ways that you deal with that is you actually take calcium citrate with meals, because that will help in terms of that not having the oxalates bind to your calcium as much. And so, basically helping to break down the oxalates more. And then magnesium citrate also can help with that too. So I'll be doing both of those. And, interestingly enough, like really getting that calcium in at each meal. The other way that I'm tackling this is via low oxalate diet. So, I will say, just as an aside, for people that are taking the oats, a lot of times high yeast will correlate with high oxalate. Mold will correlate with high oxalate. We know from page one that I don't have an issue with either of those. So it really comes down to, I think, genetics for me, and what the glyceric one indicates versus the glycolic is glyceric indicates a particular genetic SNP that, that essentially isn't as common of kidney stone formation. Like, crystals will end up in the kidneys, but it's not necessarily going to be formed into stones. I'm trying to find, let me look at my notes right here. Da, 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 da. I thought I wrote it down, but oh, here it is. So basically, in case you're curious about the genetics of it, it's genetic hyperoxalaria. I butcher these names. I apologize. Hyperoxalaria type 2. And so that's what the glyceric is connected to versus the glycolic is connected to type 1, where kidney stone formation is much more common. So basically, I'm genetically deficient in this enzyme called AGXT. I'm not going to attempt to say what the actual name is, and so that leads to higher than normal oxalate levels. So I have to do the diet. I have to go low oxalate diet. Oxalates can impact thyroid function. I've definitely had issues with subclinical hypothyroidism since at least my 20s, and I've definitely had more issues with my thyroid since my surgeries. So it's a big deal. Yeah. So what does a low oxalate diet look like? Oh man, it takes out some of my favorite foods. So spinach, this is why the green smoothie is not always a good idea for everyone. So spinach is high in oxalates. Soy is high in oxalate. Nuts, and I love, cashews, pecans, walnuts, things like that. I think almonds is one of the worst offenders when it comes to oxalates. I got to cut out chocolate. I don't really drink much of it, but black tea. Some of the other teas it's kind of a debate, but tend to be lower in oxalates. And, some of the other veggies that I love, potatoes, sweet potatoes. Um, yeah, those are kind of a big focus of what I need to take out, and really sit down and kind of look at some of the other lists of high oxalate foods, because there's, like, as I mentioned, a kind of big debate on some of these different foods and how much oxalates that they have. Um, Kale, for example, there's a big debate. Some people say it's high, some people say it's not so high. I'll probably try and stay away from that for a little while, and yeah, really focus on getting that calcium in too at the same time, and hoping that that brings, my oxalates down to a normal place. And since I do know that I have this genetic predisposition, it is something that I'm going to have to pay attention to for the long haul. Not an easy thing to learn, and um, you know now I know, now I can work with that and feel better. So I'm excited about that. um, hopefully I'm excited to see if it impacts my thyroid in any kind of way to really, bring that thyroid levels up, and thyroid function, I'd say, up, and bring inflammation down, because there's, definitely inflammation, probably in my gut more than anything else. I can feel it right now. I don't really have so much joint pain, which I feel lucky about. Um, but just as a side note, oxalates can also trap heavy metals and keep them in the body. I definitely feel like there's some heavy metal stuff happening for me. So that's interesting. Can also be a contributing factor to anemia. This was something fascinating that I found, because a lot of my clients have anemia, and some for good reason, because they have fibroids that they bleed tremendously. And, that's going to be a huge factor, obviously, in anemia. But a lot of women have anemia, and there's multiple reasons for this, but this can be one possible reason. So if you've kind of like checked off all the other possibilities, oxalate might be an issue for you. Just as a little quick aside, for those of you that have children that have autism, and I know that you have done all the research in the world around this, and don't necessarily want to hear any kind of recommendations, but there was a study done by the doctor that runs Great Plains Labs, where he found that 84% of children on the autistic spectrum had oxalate values outside the normal range. So it may just be worth, if you haven't looked into oxalates for your autistic child, and you want to, I mean, I know that there's definitely some, moms out there, like, I mean, your children are wonderful no matter what, and they don't need, fixing. So this may not be information that you need. And for those that are interested, that is something, worth checking into. Let's see. Yeah, okay. So I kind of covered the majority of what's important about oxalates, in this situation. As I mentioned, if my yeast was high, if my mold was high, that would be a whole other like can of worms to dive into. These next sections I'm doing pretty good on, which made me happy. I do have low to low normal. I guess this would probably be considered like low normal levels of citric acid. And so this section is all about the mitochondrial markers, which mitochondria is like our energy powerhouses. Like when things are going right in, thyroid and lots of other systems, like we really want to look to the mitochondria, because if our energy is low, often that mitochondria needs a little bit of a boost, and it's impacted by so many things, including all these sort of toxins and chemicals that we face on a daily basis, the onslaught. So I have low normal levels of citric acid, and this can be due to a few different things. So I'll just speak to, can be because of impaired function of the Krebs cycle, low dietary intake of citric containing foods such as citrus fruits and juices, potassium deficiency, acidosis, chronic kidney failure, diabetes, hypoparathyroidism, or excessive muscle activity. So I'm going to be really honest here. I know this is outside of the purview of some people, but I do utilize muscle testing for my clients that are interested in it, and also for myself. And so I muscle tested to see which of these were connected to the low normal citric acid. And for me, it came up Krebs cycle, low dietary intake of citric containing foods, and acidosis. So essentially, that's metabolic acidosis. So my system, my blood is too acid. It needs to be more alkaline. And that's a whole can of worms that I won't step into right now. But just that's what showed up for me, as the why. So really looking into those different aspects. And this is why these tests can be so fascinating, because you really dive into and make connections, with these different aspects of your body. So moving on to the next section, I am slightly elevated in the 3-hydroxyglutaric um, acid, and essentially that points to more to the mitochondrial dysfunction. And, so going back to, uh, you know, impaired function of my Krebs cycle is probably part of why this shows up. And so if it's higher, if this marker is higher, it often indicates genetic disease. But since mine's just slightly elevated, it's probably more mitochondrial dysfunction. So my mitochondria are like, help me out, Christine. Think about me more. Um, and I will say that one of the things that I'm doing for that is I ordered a supplement that is basically overall good support of the mitochondria, and has things like CoQ10 in it, acetyl L-carnitine, some other good stuff. There's lots of different products out there right now. This one just felt, I muscle tested strong for it, and it felt the most comprehensive. Another good one is Mito ATP from Cellcore. Lots of good stuff out there to help support your mitochondria. Let's see. Yeah, so they recommend the treatment that the lab recommends is L-carnitine or acetyl L-carnitine. And so, as I mentioned, this supplement that I ordered has both of those in there. This high number can also be connected to high Clostridia or high oxalate. So, you know, lots of different connections. Also, I have not been absorbing fats well, and I can tell that in terms of my skin has been, particularly dry. And your gallbladder is a big, big thing. Like if you're doing, all the things and you're taking fish oil, and you still have dry skin, look to your gallbladder. So, basically you need the emulsification of the bile acids that your gallbladder releases in order to break down fats and utilize them. And ever since my surgeries, I have had some issues there. There was a moment where I was like, did they take my gallbladder out and didn't tell me? They didn't, but I did have a massive abscess underneath my liver and gallbladder in the latter part of being in the hospital. Actually, it was a horrible situation where this resident had to come in to tell me, and he like whips out his phone and shows me my CT scan, on his phone. And he's like, hey, this is your liver, which was like kind of tiny. And then he was like, this is the major abscess infection that is underneath it, pushing up on it. And I was actually supposed to get out of the hospital that day after being there, for 2 weeks, aka a lifetime, because I did not sleep at all. I just started bawling because I was like, oh my God, am I going to have to go back to surgery? Like, I'm just going to keep on having these infections. And poor guy, he was just like, his eyes just got really big and he didn't know what to do. And I guess word passed around of my reaction because the sort of main doctor, I guess, came in later and she said, hey, I just want to let you know that, something like this is pretty common after what you've been through. You don't have to go into more surgery. We're just going to drain it. But essentially I ended up having this drain inside of me while I was in the hospital and for several weeks after. So I think that there was probably some damage to my liver and gallbladder, even if it's just scar tissue. So they just don't, they need a little extra support. And so, getting from me, even though I have my gallbladder, getting bile acids in, and then I got some TUDCA, which is really helpful to support the gallbladder too. So hopefully we can get my skin to be not so dry, get it all pretty again. Let's see. Next up, we've got the neurotransmitter. So I talked about this early on, how really important it is to understand how our neurotransmitters are doing. And I will be honest with you, I haven't been depressed lately, but I've had kind of sort of this blah feeling. And, life brings us that sometimes. It's not out of the ordinary in any kind of way. And it's good to see what's happening in terms of my neurotransmitters because they are connected. It is connected to how my emotional state is. So, my HVA, it looks okay on here, which is the dopamine metabolite. I'm at 2, and the reference range is zero point 0.8 to 3.6. So it looks okay. But what is actually the case, if it's below what's called the mean, which is that sort of middle point, then it does indicate that I have lowered dopamine going on. Same thing with the VMA here, which is metabolite of norepinephrine and epinephrine. So both of those are, below the mean. The VMA is actually, on the low end, straight up. And then I also have, let's see, the low H, um, 5-HIAA, which is connected, is a metabolite of serotonin. So, I can look here and see, well, okay, so I've got some lower neurotransmitters happening. Um, so lots of different possible reasons for this, from the lower absorption of dopamine's precursor amino acids, and those are like phenylalanine and tyrosine. Um, and, again, for people that are listening that have had an ostomy or have had work done, even if you've had like bypass surgery or anything, you do have to pay attention because you're not absorbing nutrients as well. So, those things that I just mentioned are all high in meat. Um, you have to have enough HCl to break down that meat well so that you can absorb. But then if you're missing part of your bowels, it's going to be harder. So this is not, super like crazy out of the blue, even though I do lots of things to support my system on a daily basis. Um, Also, there's other reasons like decreased vitamin B6, which I'll get to here in a minute, and decreased amounts of cofactors like SAMe. There's also genetic variations, and this is where, doing some genetic testing can be super super cool, because you get to see what they call, these variations, or SNPs, because all of us have some, that are impacting our ability to metabolize certain things and to utilize certain nutrients. um, so I muscle tested that B6 will help with this, and that I do actually have genetic mutations that impact dopamine production, which doesn't surprise me because I definitely did deal with depression as a teenager, and at different points in my 20s for sure. So, here we are in the genes again, right? And how do we support that? So B6 is a really big one. In terms of the lowered serotonin, I'm going to do some 5-HTP to see how that goes. Um, Side note, B6 is super, super important for hormones in terms of your estrogen, too much estrogen dominant situation, and also in support of progesterone productions. It also helps to reduce histamines that can contribute to PMS. And it's super important with blood sugar balance, which we know is key to cortisol regulation. So B6 is super important. It's also super important you don't get too much of it. So, work with a practitioner around supplementing that. Let's see what is next. I jumped around on here. Okay, so next page, I think that's the important stuff on that page. The next page, that is worth noting something, is the ketone and fatty acid oxidation section. So, this is very interesting because it basically comes down to, excuse me, if you are on keto, like, these are going to be higher, right? I'm not on keto. I do eat a decent amount of fat, but probably not enough to impact these numbers in this way. So I do have high 3-hydroxybutyric acid and also high acetoatic acid, and quite elevated. So the 3-hydroxybutyric is high end should be 3.1, and I'm at 26. The acetoacetic is high end should be 10, and I'm at 167. So really, this probably comes down to, once again, an issue with my fat absorption abilities. I'm burning through these fatty acids and I'm just not absorbing the fats very well. So this is where I'm focusing on bile acids and the TUDCA in order to support that breakdown of fat and utilization of fat and getting my skin nice and supple again. And that will most likely bring this numbers down because I'm actually utilizing the fat properly. um, and then I have high seberic. This apparently is very normal on this test because it's consistent with an overnight fast, which I didn't eat for 12 hours before taking this test. Also, acetyl L-carnitine is helpful in this situation too. So I've already got that covered. And then let's dive down into the nutritional markers section. So this goes into the B vitamins, as I mentioned earlier, plus vitamin C, vitamin CoQ10, glutathione, and biotin. Did I miss the glutathione section? Let's see. Nope, it's coming up next. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. So basically, I was very happy that my B12 was up because that's something that, as I mentioned earlier, is not necessarily um, absorbed as well when you miss part of your colon. And just a lot of people are low on B12. And I do think that I have some genetic predisposition, a genetic SNP that doesn't allow me to work it as well. But I have been taking some B12, methylated B12. So that's obviously doing well. Lo and behold, I'm low on B6. And, several of the issues that I have, several markers being high, a huge part of that is being low on B6. So I'm excited. I got a B6 complex that is inclusive of some of these other B vitamins that are lower too. And, methylated versions when necessary. Terms of vitamin C, it's totally normal for it to be low on this test because it has a half-life of 6 hours. So if you have fasted overnight, then you essentially don't have any vitamin C. It's going to be kicking in your urine, or the metabolites are going to be kicking in your urine. So I'm not too worried about that. My CoQ10 is low, which wasn't super surprising either. So that I incorporated in that mito support. The NAC here, which is the precursor to glutathione, that can also be low at 0, like it is for me, because it's converted. It needs to be converted to be used as glutathione. So it's totally fine that it lands here at 0. It just means, the conversions happened. So yeah, that's where we're looking at in terms of the B markers. And just as a note for those that are watching this, and if you take those tests, they have several markers where they have a little asterisk, and they say, high value for this marker may indicate a deficiency of this vitamin. So it's something to pay attention to. Even with vitamin B2 here, I mean, I'm within the broad range, but it's still a little bit high, and so that's not that I necessarily have too high of that of B2, but rather that I have too low of B2. Next page is our glutathione. So my glutathione is doing pretty well on the whole, although my methylation, which is like an aspect of the glutathione, the use of glutathione essentially is right at the high end of the sort of broad reference range. So, basically just knowing that like I'm using up that glutathione. So I need it, and keeping it going. And I do take glutathione. I go back and forth between taking glutathione and NAC, its precursor. And sometimes I take both at the same time. My liver definitely needs a lot of love. I think that there was issues genetically before, and then, as I mentioned, going through the surgeries, it's made it even more of a need. Ladies that are in your 40s, I guarantee your liver needs some extra love too. I put all of my clients on some sort of liver support. So finally, we're coming to the end here. The amino acid metabolites are all sort of, low or within range. And it's kind of normal for them to show up that way. It's more of a concern if they are high. It can mean different things. So, the mineral metabolism of phosphoric, there's a little bit low here in terms of phosphate. Not too concerned about it, but that may be due to some of the processes in my body not sort of working as well as they can. Just for those that are watching, you can see if you jump down here, it goes into interpretation. That's actually pretty good. Not all tests have like great interpretations, but this one gives you a lot of reasons of why you have high or low, of the numbers that you're high or low in, and also ways to deal with that. So, that was very helpful. I'd still work with somebody on this test, on taking this test. I think you have to order it through a practitioner anyway, but definitely someone to assess it, because there's lots of connections, as I talked about here. That just a sort of printing out of the descriptions aren't going to tell you. So you really want to be able to connect the mold and the yeast to the Clostridia, and to the neurotransmitters and all of these things. And so, you guys, that was the big discussion of my oats test. And I hope that it was helpful for you. I hope that, that you found some use and some connections between maybe something that's happening with you, and maybe how this test can help you. I am, bringing it into the fold in terms of what I utilize with clients, because it really gives us such a wealth of information. It's pretty amazing, as you can see and can hear from today's episode. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. I'm just diving more and more into this test, and all the things that it can and do and tell you. So feel free to shoot me an email, and I am going to leave you with that. It's always good to be here with you guys. Excited about some things that are to come that I will be letting you know about over the next couple of weeks. So if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, do that now so you don't miss a single episode. And I'm super, super grateful for people that leave reviews. I know it takes a minute. Sometimes you have to sign up, on iTunes and everything, but it's so helpful. I do this as a labor of love. I love doing it, but it definitely takes, time and energy and preparation and all these things. And so those reviews are such a good, powerful gift for me to receive from you. It helps the podcast grow. It also, helps me to know, like, oh, are people really, getting something from this? So I really appreciate it with all my heart. I will see you next week, and I hope you have a great one.